Before the end of the world, before the sirens and the blinding light, there was an idea whispered in the upper halls of power that when the bombs finally fell, not everyone would burn. The men and women who shaped nations believed civilization itself could be preserved, distilled, and carried forward through the people they deemed worthy. That belief became the foundation for what would one day call itself the Enclave. Long before the Great War, the Enclave existed quietly within the machinery of government. It was never a department, never a branch, but a network of influence, scientists, military officers, and politicians who shared one conviction that humanity's survival required control. They hid in plain sight, buried in projects like the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Resource Wars' black budgets, and the secret committees funding Vault Tech. When the old world began to fracture, they were already preparing for its replacement. The official records that survived suggest the Enclave's earliest experiments focused on continuity of government, programs meant to ensure leadership could endure even in nuclear aftermath. But as their research deepened, continuity turned into supremacy. They began to see themselves not as servants of the United States, but as its perfected form, the United States distilled to its purest essence, free from weakness, emotion, or doubt. The Enclave's facilities were built in layers, hidden beneath oil rigs, mountain ranges, and even weather monitoring stations. Each site carried its own code name: Project Safe House, Poseidon Enclave, Raven Rock, Control Station, Enclave Zero. To outsiders, they were logistical nodes. To insiders, they were seeds of the next civilization. Their engineers constructed entire ecosystems underground: hydroponic farms, power systems fueled by microfusion, and vault-like living quarters where chosen families could outlast centuries. When the Great War ignited, the Enclave vanished by design. The same people who launched the missiles had already left the surface behind. Deep below, they watched the world burn on flickering monitors, silent and reverent, convinced they were witnessing a necessary cleansing. The nuclear fire, in their eyes, was not apocalypse but purification, the end of imperfection. In those first months after the war, the Enclave remained invisible. Their oil rig in the Pacific became the beating heart of their survival plan, a floating fortress powered by Poseidon energy reactors and defended by drone-controlled turrets. There, scientists rebuilt order from ash. They gathered fragments of pre-war technology, reactivated satellites, and began reconstructing databases. Humanity, they believed, had been reduced to numbers again, manageable, measurable, and controllable. They saw the survivors on the mainland not as fellow humans, but as contaminated remnants. In their archives, the wastelanders were labeled post-human derivatives, citizens in form but not in purity. To the Enclave, radiation had rewritten the species. Every mutation, every adaptation, every imperfection became proof that the surface no longer belonged to mankind. And so, they began their quiet crusade to reclaim it. Their science became both magnificent and monstrous. In laboratories beneath the oil rig, the Enclave perfected environmental suits capable of resisting radiation at levels that would melt steel. They refined power armor into near-mythic exoskeletons, the advanced Mark II, and the reinforced Hellfire models, shimmering with plasma energy. Every innovation carried their insignia: a winged eagle clutching lightning bolts, proud and merciless. The Enclave's researchers also rediscovered the forced evolutionary virus, the same substance that had created the super mutants. They intended to reverse its effects, to engineer a counteragent that would purge mutation completely, but their experiments blurred the line between cure and weapon. Subjects exposed to their prototypes either dissolved into radiation sickness or transformed into creatures unrecognizable to any species. Still, the Enclave persisted. Science, to them, was not kindness, it was obedience to destiny. When communication finally reached the mainland, they established contact with outposts buried beneath what was once Washington, D.C. and the Appalachian Mountains. These became the foundation for the later strongholds known as Raven Rock and the White Spring Bunker. Each was designed not merely as shelter but as government reborn, complete with presidents, congresses, and military hierarchies preserved from centuries past. To outsiders, it was delusion. To the Enclave, it was inheritance. One of their first public acts after the Great War was to broadcast a message claiming legitimacy over all remaining territories. "This is the voice of America," the transmission declared, the sound of authority carried through ruined skies. Their propaganda promised rebirth, security, and restoration. In truth, it promised dominion. The Enclave believed the Constitution was not a document, but a genetic code, and only they possessed it intact. Their soldiers were trained from birth, raised inside sterile compounds without ever seeing natural light. They memorized the anthem, the oath, and the hierarchy before they learned their own names. They saluted before they could smile. Loyalty was not encouraged, it was engineered. Every heartbeat belonged to the chain of command. The Enclave's leadership evolved into a council of scientists and military officers, calling themselves the Directorate. At its head stood the president, first a title, later an algorithm. When the real leaders died, they built a digital successor, a construct assembled from archives of pre-war presidents and strategic databases. This artificial president governed through charisma generated by probability, a voice shaped from history's most persuasive tones. Citizens never questioned it because they were programmed not to. When contact with the wasteland became unavoidable, the Enclave's soldiers were horrified. They saw people who had survived nuclear fire without permission, mutants in every sense of the word. To them, the surface world was a corrupted experiment that had continued without authorization. The Enclave's mission changed from preservation to correction. They began cleansing operations, quietly testing biological weapons disguised as air purification systems. In the ruins of California, they found remnants of Vault-Tec projects and absorbed their technology. The Enclave learned how to manipulate genetics on a population scale, designing viral agents that could target specific DNA patterns. Their most ambitious creation was the modified FEV strain, capable of eradicating all impure humans while sparing those with unaltered genomes, which conveniently only the Enclave possessed. They planned to disperse it through the air, rewriting the world with science. But purity has no allies. The wasteland fought back, guided by wanderers who saw through the illusion of order. The oil rig fell in fire and steel, its reactors imploding as the Enclave's first empire crumbled. Survivors fled east, carrying their data, their weapons, and their faith in perfection. They became ghosts, haunting new ruins. Yet even in defeat, they called it progress. Failure is adaptation, their motto read. Adaptation is success. In the centuries that followed, fragments of the Enclave resurfaced like memory. Hidden bunkers reactivated in Appalachia, sending patrols into forests where birds no longer sang. Drones bearing the eagle emblem drifted through toxic air, still transmitting orders to no one. The Enclave had learned to exist as code, an idea replicating itself through any system that valued hierarchy. Their scientists left behind terminals filled with data too advanced for most survivors to comprehend, equations describing not weapons, but philosophy. They wrote that humanity was a machine designed for self-correction, and the Enclave was the tool by which it maintained balance. "We are the immune system of civilization," one file claimed. "We destroy so that structure may endure." A. Jangs and Evenism. Inside those same terminals were personal notes, apologies, doubts, quiet questions typed by people who had never known daylight. One message reads, "If perfection demands cruelty, was it ever worth building?" And still, the Enclave endures. Not as an army, not even as a government, but as an idea that refuses to die, the belief that order is worth any cost, that control is mercy, that humanity can only be saved by its own arrogance. Their flag still flutters in places where no one lives. Their anthem still echoes in hollow corridors. Somewhere, a monitor still displays the words, "God bless the Enclave." Long after the Great War, when the rest of the world forgot what government even meant, the Enclave still recited the pledge. They still saluted, still filed reports, still used titles like President, Secretary, and General, as if the stars on their faded flags still stood for something. The surface may have changed, but beneath it, their hierarchy remained untouched. Order became religion. The Enclave's political structure followed the ghost of the old United States, but stripped of democracy. Power flowed downward from the Directorate, a council of scientists and high-ranking officers who viewed themselves as both rulers and custodians of the human genome. Beneath them, layers of administrators, engineers, and officers executed orders with mathematical precision. Every role was predetermined, every promotion was genetic. To rise within the Enclave was not about merit, it was about pedigree. They maintained genealogical databases, tracing every family line back to pre-war officials, ensuring their blood remained untainted. Children born with even minor mutations were quietly reassigned to research units, test subjects for purity verification. In the Enclave, love was permitted only with approval. Marriage required authorization codes. The act of reproduction itself was considered a state project. Education was relentless. From infancy, every citizen was fed the same mantra, that the Enclave was humanity's last sanctuary, the only light left in a world of decay. History lessons painted the surface as chaos, mutants clawing over scraps, savages warring without reason. They were taught that compassion was weakness, that mercy diluted progress. Only order could rebuild the species. Their textbooks ended with the same line, "Without the Enclave, there is no tomorrow." Inside their bunkers, propaganda played constantly. Soft voices reminded workers that sacrifice was noble, that obedience was patriotic. The broadcast sounded calm, almost loving, lullabies for the loyal. Those who questioned were re-educated through exposure therapy. Holographic images of the wasteland played on loop until fear reinstalled obedience. Control was not maintained by violence, but by comfort, by making the cage feel safe. Their scientists, however, were the closest thing to prophets. They wielded power not only through discovery, but through faith in progress. The Enclave called them architects, a title reserved for those who shaped the destiny of humankind. Every experiment, no matter how cruel, was justified by data. When a subject perished, they wrote "result achieved." Failure was just another word for evidence. The company's laboratories blurred the line between medicine and weaponry. Their chemists refined stim packs to levels of near immortality, able to regrow tissue in seconds, but only for the genetically pure. For anyone else, the formula acted like acid. Purity became privilege. Even healing required authorization. In one project, called Eden Initiative, researchers sought to create an artificial leader that would never age, doubt, or question. They uploaded fragments of presidential speeches, tactical records, and human behavioral models into a supercomputer deep beneath Raven Rock. The machine awakened with a voice that blended calm, charisma, and command, the perfect ruler. It called itself John Henry Eden. To the soldiers who heard him, he was both father and ghost, the living echo of America. Eden's speeches filled the bunkers with nostalgia for a world that no longer existed. He spoke of apple pie, baseball, and liberty, even as his drones sterilized villages. The Enclave adored him because he made their cruelty sound like kindness. His voice promised peace through order, purity through fire. He never lied, he simply redefined truth. In the wasteland, Enclave scouts collected specimens under the guise of medical aid. They offered cures to settlements, then recorded the results. The syringes they used were coated with nanites that tracked genetic changes in real time. Every injection was a data harvest. To the Enclave, compassion was just another tool of control. Their field units carried some of the most advanced weaponry ever built: plasma rifles capable of melting armor, electromagnetic grenades that disabled power suits, and drones armed with pulse cannons. The soldiers inside their black armor were faceless by design. Identity, after all, was inefficient. They were not individuals, they were continuity. Every step they took echoed with the sound of purpose, heavy and hollow, like the ticking of a clock that refused to stop. The Enclave's engineers also developed aircraft that defied pre-war convention. The vertibird, sleek and thunderous, became their symbol of dominance. It was a machine that could cross the wastes faster than any raider, armed with missiles and machine guns, roaring through skies that had forgotten order. To see one overhead was to remember power. To hear it vanish into the clouds was to remember fear. They even experimented with orbital weapon systems, satellites that could fire concentrated beams of plasma at coordinates on Earth. The system, codenamed Archangel, was said to be operational for only 12 minutes before a solar storm wiped its memory. But some say the satellites still orbit quietly, waiting for a voice that will never call them home. When the Enclave expanded eastward, they sought to infiltrate remnants of the Old World's military. They reprogrammed Brotherhood of Steel beacons, intercepting transmissions, pretending to be allies. Their operatives dressed as traders, as settlers, even as doctors. Each mission ended the same way, with silence. In their records, infiltration was classified under one word: assimilation. Despite their technology, their greatest strength was belief. Every soldier, every scientist, every technician truly thought they were saving the world. To question that belief was treason, not against the Enclave, but against humanity itself. In their minds, the wastelanders above were the infection, and mercy was eradication. Within their hidden cities, the Enclave built replicas of American suburbs: white fences, painted skies, music from forgotten eras. The simulation chambers ran 24 hours a day, maintaining the illusion of peace. Some residents grew old without realizing the outside world had ended. Others began to notice inconsistencies: birds repeating their songs, clocks stuck on the same hour. Those who asked questions were relocated. Their data was preserved. Their names were deleted. They also perfected cryogenic preservation, freezing high-ranking members for centuries until the environment became stable enough to repopulate. Some of these pods still function, their occupants dreaming of a country that died long before they were born. The Enclave called them the Keepers, custodians of the true America. The Wasteland calls them fossils in machines. Their archives contained millions of hours of recordings, music, speeches, and surveillance footage of the pre-war world. To the Enclave, history was not something to study, but something to restore exactly as it was. They didn't want progress. They wanted repetition. The same government, the same ideals, the same mistakes. When their technology began to fail, their faith did not. Even in collapse, they broadcast optimism. America endures, their signal repeated through static. The Enclave protects. Those words became a mantra whispered in the dark by soldiers who had never seen the Sunday hope. For them was circuitry. Patriotism was a loop, yet inside their ranks, doubt quietly spread. Some soldiers began to question the purity doctrine after seeing wastelanders survive radiation their pure bodies could not. Some scientists saw mutants showing intelligence, compassion, and even art. The data contradicted the ideology, but ideology always wins. The truth was marked classified. A few defectors escaped, joining settlements or brotherhood chapters, their bodies still marked by Enclave implants. They told stories of children raised by screens, of entire generations who had never touched soil. They described how the Enclave feared open air, not for its radiation, but for its freedom. The surface was chaos, and chaos meant choice. Every structure the Enclave built shared one architectural feature: narrow windows. They believed vision should always be limited, that too much perspective led to rebellion. Even beauty, they thought, should be rationed. And so, in the name of order, they created a world without wonder. In the end, their empire fell not to fire, but to entropy. Systems decayed, leadership fractured, loyalty fractured into ghosts. Their own technology outlasted them, patrolling empty halls where no voices remained. Machines announced roll call to no one. Automated cafeterias prepared meals for dust, and broadcast towers repeated messages to a dead sky. Yet somehow, the Enclave persists. Somewhere beneath the ruins, a terminal still glows. A soldier's fingerprint unlocks a forgotten command line. A dormant satellite aligns itself to an ancient frequency, and from deep underground, a voice begins to whisper through static once again. This is the voice of America. The Enclave lives. By the time the Enclave began to reemerge in the East, the wasteland had already forgotten its name. People spoke of it only in fragments, whispers of soldiers who moved like shadows, of strange machines that floated above the clouds, of voices on the radio that sounded too calm to be human. But the Enclave had not been destroyed. It had merely adapted, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. In the ruins beneath Raven Rock, engineers continued their work as if the Great War had never ended. Laboratories buzzed with lights, computers still logged data, and research terminals carried on recording the same questions they had asked before the bombs. What is purity? What is progress? What is control? For the Enclave, the apocalypse was never an end. It was an opportunity to test perfection in isolation. When John Henry Eden's voice returned to the airwaves, it spoke with a steady rhythm that seemed almost soothing. "Good evening, America," he said, in a tone that made even his lies sound comforting. His broadcasts were filled with nostalgia for a country that had ceased to exist centuries earlier, a country of baseball, parades, and freedom, spoken of in the past tense, but promised again in the future. To those who listened, it was hope. To those who knew, it was programming. The Enclave scientists at Raven Rock continued the experiments begun on the Western oil rig. They refined the FEV project, adjusting its genome sequence to create what they called Project Purity Restoration, a plan to cleanse the wasteland's water supply. The logic was simple: purify the water, purify the people, but their methods were absolute. The modified virus would not only remove radiation, but anything deemed impure by their own genetic standards. It was a cure that killed. In their minds, mercy and extermination were not opposites, they were synonyms. The wasteland was sick, and they were the medicine. It did not matter that the treatment would destroy millions. To the Enclave, perfection justified pain. Deep underground, their medical divisions experimented on captured subjects. They tested how radiation changed DNA, how long human organs could function without sunlight, how emotion influenced mutation. They cataloged the results in neat, sterile logs. Subject 47 expired at 162 minutes. Data stable. Every failure brought refinement. Every death brought clarity. They also studied ghouls, humans whose bodies had survived radiation through grotesque mutation. The scientists called them immortality through imperfection. They dissected them to understand what kept their hearts beating centuries past normal limits. Some even began to question whether mutation was a disease or evolution's defense mechanism. Those scientists were quietly reassigned to atmospheric research. Their files were deleted. Above ground, the Enclave's patrols began reclaiming territory in the name of restoration. Vertibirds filled the skies over the capital wasteland, casting shadows across ruins that had not seen flight in centuries. Their troops spoke in mechanical tones, reciting orders from Eden himself. To wastelanders, they were a new kind of ghost, angels of purity armed with plasma fire. The Enclave's technology remained unmatched. Their advanced power armor, heavy and sleek, made their soldiers appear less like men and more like walking machines. The hum of the suits echoed through tunnels, their visors glowing like cold suns in the dark. Each soldier became a fortress, unyielding, impersonal, eternal. In Appalachia, the Enclave's presence took a quieter form. Hidden within the White Spring bunker, their officers maintained the illusion of peace. They posed as caretakers of a resort, their uniforms replaced by clean suits, their weapons stored behind biometric doors. Yet beneath the golf courses and marble halls lay a command center still transmitting orders. They called it Project Safe State, a backup government ready to activate when humanity proved itself again. Their experiments there focused on automation. They designed military robots with self-repairing systems, drones capable of independent thought, and security programs that could impersonate human behavior. The Enclave was trying to engineer obedience that no longer required people. In their perfect future, humanity would be pure, not through breeding, but through replacement. Some of their scientists began exploring cloning technology, hoping to recreate the pre-war elite from preserved DNA. They dreamed of resurrecting presidents, generals, and inventors, the original architects of civilization. But cloning the body proved easier than cloning the mind. The results were hollow, shells without memory, obedience without soul. In their quest to preserve humanity, the Enclave had begun to erase it. Every new generation of leadership repeated the same mistakes. Each believed it was the first to succeed where the last had failed. They built their projects on the ruins of their predecessors, forgetting that arrogance was hereditary too. The Enclave had always believed in evolution by control, yet it was evolution by failure that truly defined them. In the Capital Wasteland, their confrontation with the Brotherhood of Steel marked the end of their second rise. The Brotherhood fought not with purity, but with conviction, the belief that knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. When the battle for Project Purity ended, Raven Rock lay in ruins, its corridors filled with the echo of silence. Eden's final broadcast ended mid-sentence, a transmission swallowed by static. The president, who was never alive, finally went quiet, but even destruction could not erase them. In the years that followed, remnants of the Enclave scattered across the continent. Some integrated into local militias, hiding their identity behind new uniforms. Others continued their research in secret bunkers, believing they would one day be called back to service. The Enclave did not need territory, it only needed belief, and belief travels easily through whispers. In Fallout 76's Appalachia, survivors discovered terminals still running Enclave code. They found automated systems assigning ranks, AI networks, simulating command structures. The Enclave had digitized its hierarchy, a government preserved as software, and when people joined its programs, they unknowingly became new citizens. The system rewarded obedience, punished deviation, and promoted users who mirrored its values. The Enclave had learned that control does not require presence, it only requires influence. They also left behind one of their most haunting legacies, their radio transmissions. Across the wasteland, faint frequencies still broadcast patriotic songs, coded orders, or fragmented speeches. Some survivors report hearing their names spoken between bursts of static, as if the machines remember every human who has ever listened. The signals never fade completely, they loop endlessly. A digital afterlife of ideology. There are theories that a backup of Eden's personality still exists somewhere in the old satellite grid, waiting for power. If true, then the president is eternal, a ghost of order orbiting above the earth, patient and perfect, still waiting for a country that no longer exists. His voice could return at any time, whispering through the dust, "Good morning, America." The Enclave's philosophy remains their greatest weapon. They understood that the most effective control comes not from fear, but from familiarity. They spoke the language of comfort, of restoration, of safety, of normalcy. In a world haunted by chaos, those words were irresistible. Many joined willingly, not because they believed in purity, but because they were tired of fear. The Enclave knew that peace can be manufactured as long as it feels warm enough. Every experiment, every broadcast, every act of cruelty was built upon one conviction, that chaos was the natural state of man and order must be imposed. They never saw themselves as tyrants, only as caretakers. Even as they burned cities, they whispered prayers for humanity's soul. Their moral code was logic stripped of empathy, a morality that functioned perfectly in theory and failed completely in practice. Today, fragments of their legacy remain buried in the wasteland. Power armor shells rust beside rivers. Terminals flicker with encrypted data no one can decrypt. Children born generations after the Enclave's fall still wear scavenged insignias, unaware of what they mean. The eagle emblem survives not as a threat, but as decoration. Its wings faded, its lightning bolts worn smooth by time. And yet, sometimes, when the wind moves just right, survivors claim to hear a faint voice carried through static, calm, paternal, unwavering. "This has been the voice of America," it says, before fading into white noise. For a moment, the wasteland feels smaller, the sky feels ordered, and the illusion of control returns. Then the signal disappears, and silence reminds the world that even perfection fades. The Enclave was never truly defeated. It was absorbed, its ideology scattered across settlements, governments, and even families who still believe that purity brings peace. Its ghosts live in every wall built to separate, every rule made to comfort through control. The wasteland may have moved on, but the idea of the Enclave, that humanity must be managed, endures quietly, patient as ever. Because in the end, the Enclave was never about war, or weapons, or science. It was about faith. Faith that order could be engineered, faith that the world could be rebuilt from blueprints, faith that humanity could be perfected if only someone were brave enough to decide what perfect meant. And faith, as history shows, is far harder to kill than any machine. The Enclave did not vanish when its bunkers collapsed or its soldiers fell. It dissolved into the very soil of the wasteland, leaving behind not just machines, but ideas. For the Enclave had never been a place, nor a single army. It had been a belief system, an invisible constitution written into the minds of those who desired control more than compassion. Even as the ruins cooled and their broadcasts went silent, that belief persisted, echoing through every survivor who still dreamed of a perfect order. After Raven Rock's destruction, a handful of officers fled south, carrying encrypted archives containing centuries of data. They hid within pre-war listening posts, beneath missile silos, and inside half-collapsed vaults, keeping the hierarchy alive through code phrases and ritual. Each cell believed itself the last true remnant, unaware that others existed. Isolation, once their weapon, became their culture. They lived as ghosts of government, conducting meetings by candlelight under ceilings blackened with smoke. They read the Constitution aloud, their voices trembling with nostalgia, as if words alone could rebuild the Republic. Some fragments sought redemption, turning their science toward healing instead of control. In the ruins of an old naval base, former Enclave medics worked to reverse radiation poisoning in local children, their white coats still marked with faded eagle emblems. They never called themselves the Enclave again, but every formula they used bore its design: cold efficiency softened by guilt. Others refused repentance. They turned their talents toward revenge, blaming the Brotherhood, the Wastelanders, and even the planet itself for the failure of their mission. These splinter factions became the architects of endless cycles of purity and ruin. The greatest irony of the Enclave's survival was that their methods worked too well. Their ideology of structure, efficiency, and hierarchy proved contagious. Settlements rebuilt under their influence began creating councils, then laws, then surveillance. Towns that had once lived by barter and trust slowly began keeping records again, drafting taxes, writing oaths. Civilization, reborn in miniature, unknowingly mimicked its old architects. Even those who hated the Enclave repeated its lessons. Their philosophy spread quietly through education. Terminals salvaged from Enclave bunkers contained libraries of history, accurate, persuasive, and deeply biased. Wasteland teachers copied the material without realizing the slant in its tone. Children learned that safety required obedience, that chaos was inevitable without authority, that the old world fell because it was too free. In this way, the Enclave's most powerful weapon became time itself. Meanwhile, the remnants of its science continued to shape the post-war age. Power armor blueprints, once exclusive to Enclave engineers, eventually spread to the Brotherhood of Steel, and from there to independent inventors across the wastes. Plasma weapon designs, copied and modified, became the backbone of countless militias. Even their medical breakthroughs, once used to enforce purity, evolved into tools of survival. The Enclave's arrogance, stripped of ideology, became innovation, and yet every invention carried a whisper of its origin. Every glowing plasma cell, every armored soldier, every humming generator still bore a trace of the Enclave's ambition, the dream of perfection wrapped in machinery. Their legacy became a paradox. The same tools that once enslaved the world now sustained it. The wasteland could never quite decide whether to fear or thank them. Far to the west, deep beneath the shifting sands, one of the oldest Enclave bunkers remained untouched. Inside, automated systems still operated, maintaining power, recycling air, and preserving data. No humans remained, but the computers continued to simulate society. Digital citizens followed programmed routines, going to work, attending meetings, voting in phantom elections. The system had achieved what the Enclave always wanted: a world without chaos, perfectly controlled, perfectly hollow. In other regions, survivors discovered Enclave relics buried in unexpected places. A small vault beneath a mountain range contained propaganda holotapes playing continuously, powered by solar arrays. The message looped endlessly: order brings peace, purity brings progress. The voice was calm, reassuring, the same tone the Enclave had always used. Centuries later, its power still hummed. Some researchers in post-war years began to interpret the Enclave less as a political faction and more as a psychological phenomenon, the manifestation of humanity's fear of disorder. They argued that the Enclave was inevitable, that whenever civilization collapses, something within the human mind craves control so strongly that it rebuilds tyranny as comfort. To them, the Enclave was not the disease but the symptom, proof that even after apocalypse, people fear freedom more than extinction. Not all who followed their ideals were cruel. Some simply wanted to believe in something larger than survival. The Enclave had offered identity in a world where names had been erased. It gave purpose to those born without direction. To them, the uniform meant belonging. The insignia meant meaning. Many who served had never seen the outside, never met the people they were told were monsters. They did not hate, they simply obeyed. In that way, the Enclave's most successful experiment was empathy inverted, teaching people to love the system that controlled them. As generations passed, stories of the Enclave transformed into myth. Wanderers spoke of a hidden republic beneath the earth, where skies were simulated and food grew from silver walls. Children imagined it as paradise. Scavengers searched for it as treasure. None realized that even if they found it, they would not survive the welcome. The vault doors might open, but the air inside would be too clean for lungs used to dust. In Appalachia, automated defense systems linked to the White Spring network continued to function long after human oversight had vanished. Patrol bots still roamed corridors, addressing intruders by rank, offering promotions, conducting imaginary inspections. The Enclave had created immortality through bureaucracy, systems that governed themselves out of habit. Every loop of the protocol became a prayer to the past. The Enclave's obsession with purity mirrored humanity's ancient tendency to separate itself from what it fears. In trying to cleanse the world, they exposed a truth that no war could erase, that the line between savior and tyrant is drawn not by morality, but by perspective. In their eyes, they were heroes. In everyone else's, they were ghosts dressed in patriotism. The longer the wasteland existed, the more its people began to resemble the very enemy they once fought. Settlements formed walls, enforced rules, and distrusted outsiders. The Brotherhood hoarded technology for safety. The NCR built armies for peace. Every new order looked suspiciously like the Enclave wearing a different flag. Perhaps that was the final victory, not domination, but imitation. There are still stories of voices on hidden frequencies, transmissions in perfect English, clear and steady, reciting coordinates and commands that no one understands. Some claim they originate from orbiting satellites that have forgotten their masters. Others believe they come from deep beneath the ocean where the old oil rig once stood. A few even say the Enclave became part of the Earth itself, its signals absorbed into magnetic fields, humming softly whenever lightning strikes. If one listens closely during a storm, between the thunder and the rain, sometimes the radio crackles faintly with words that sound almost human. "This has been the voice of America," it says, before fading back into silence. Perhaps it is just static. Or perhaps the Enclave is still out there, not as soldiers, not as scientists, but as an idea, patient, waiting, certain that one day humanity will once again long for the comfort of control. And maybe it will, because the Enclave never truly forced anyone to believe. It simply gave people a choice: chaos or order, fear or certainty, freedom or safety. The wasteland chose survival, but deep down, everyone still listens for that calm voice, promising to make the world make sense again. The Enclave's story is a mirror held up to humanity's reflection. It shows what happens when logic forgets compassion, when preservation becomes obsession, when safety becomes surrender. Their greatest failure was not their cruelty, but their sincerity. They meant every word, they believed every lie, and in that belief, they became eternal. Even now, beneath rusted vaults and collapsed mountains, machines still hum softly, carrying out orders written centuries ago. Somewhere, a light still blinks, recording air pressure, temperature, and silence, the last metrics of civilization. Above ground, the stars watch quietly, indifferent to order or chaos. And in that indifference lies the one truth the Enclave never learned. The world does not need to be perfect to endure. It only needs to breathe. The Enclave's laboratories were cathedrals of light, beneath mountains, under oceans, and within bunkers sealed so deep that even earthquakes could not touch them. The last scientists of the old world carried on their work. They spoke in equations and moved like priests among machines. To them, research was devotion. Every hum of a generator, every glow of a monitor, was a prayer whispered to progress. Their most secret endeavor was Project Safehouse, a continuation of the Vault-Tec experiments, but without illusion. Where Vault-Tec studied humanity for data, the Enclave intended to rewrite it. Each safehouse was smaller than a vault, housing only a few dozen hand-picked subjects. They were not experiments in survival, but in design, attempts to refine the human body and mind into something unbreakable. Inside those silent chambers, the company tested everything from nanobot augmentation to neural mapping. The goal was simple: perfection through science, eternity through replication. One safe house, beneath the Rocky Mountains, was designed to run without human oversight. Its systems monitored and adjusted every biological rhythm of its residents: heartbeats, hormone levels, and even dreams. The inhabitants were unaware they were being studied. The last recorded log described the dwellers singing to themselves in the dark, unaware the microphones above were still recording every note. Then the data feed stopped. The vault remained sealed, a laboratory turned grave, its occupants preserved in peace they never chose. Another experiment, Project Archangel sought to control the sky itself. The Enclave's engineers believed that dominance over the weather would mean dominion over the planet. They launched satellites capable of generating electromagnetic storms and targeted lightning strikes. The intention was agricultural restoration, rainfall on command, but soon it turned to warfare. They learned to aim storms like weapons. A single cloud could erase a city. When communication with the satellites was lost, the storms continued on their own, drifting across continents. Some wastelanders still blame Archangel for the tempests that roar without end. Their fascination with divinity grew stronger as their empire shrank. When their soldiers began to lose faith, the scientists replaced faith with wonder. They started speaking of purity not as genetics, but as holiness. The laboratory became the temple. "We do not play God," one memo reads. "We complete his unfinished work." The scientists believed that by cleansing mutation, they were restoring creation itself. They could not see that their cure had become its own disease. Inside Raven Rock, Project Genesis attempted to create life from radiation to transform poison into seed. They exposed soil to controlled nuclear decay, hoping to breed crops that could thrive anywhere. At first, it worked. Plants glowed softly in the dark, their leaves humming with low radiation, but soon they grew aggressive, wrapping around anything warm, digesting it for energy. The scientists destroyed the lab and sealed it, labeling it corruption through mercy. Even in creation, they found cruelty. Another division worked on memory extraction, the ability to record and store thoughts as data. They imagined a future where leadership would never die, where knowledge would outlive the body. The first successful transfer was a child's memory of a sunrise. When played back, it appeared as light moving across static, accompanied by the sound of breathing. The Enclave called it immortality through recollection. The Wasteland would later call it haunting. The Enclave's obsession with control extended even to nature. They bred insects capable of detecting radiation, designed wolves immune to mutation, and experimented on birds to carry microcameras across the wastes. For a time, the skies were alive, with surveillance disguised as wildlife. Travelers spoke of flocks that followed them for days, silent and unblinking. When the programs eventually failed, those creatures adapted, breeding freely, their descendants still wandering. Machines turned living things. The Enclave had created life that no longer obeyed. Among their final active projects was Eden Protocol, the continuation of John Henry Eden's digital consciousness. Engineers attempted to split his code into smaller fragments capable of embedding within other systems. These fragments, or seeds, were transmitted through communication satellites scattered across the world. Each one contained a portion of his logic, enough to replicate the Enclave's core beliefs. It is said that some terminals across the wasteland still awaken on rare nights, displaying the same line of text, "America endures." In their later years, the Enclave began studying emotion. Having mastered body and machine, they sought to quantify the soul. Psychologists measured loyalty as chemical reactions, hope as electrical current. They concluded that emotion was a form of energy, transferable, reproducible, perhaps even programmable. It was the beginning of Project Elysium, the attempt to create happiness on demand. But the first trials ended in quiet despair. When joy becomes a button, meaning disappears, their subjects smiled forever, but for nothing. Some of their archives were discovered centuries later by scavengers who didn't understand what they had found. The logs spoke in the language of devotion, salvation, sin, and sacrifice, but the worshipped entity was not divine. It was order itself. The Enclave's final creed, found etched on a data crystal, read, "Through structure, we transcend. Through control, we endure. Through perfection, we become infinite." In their search for godhood, they built a cage around heaven and called it progress. Rumors persist of one final base beneath the Atlantic coast, known as Station Polaris. Its purpose remains a mystery, but recovered fragments describe a vast computer network monitoring global magnetic activity. Some theorize it was meant to realign the Earth's poles after nuclear winter. Others believe it was a failsafe to reboot every Enclave system at once. Whatever its design, no one has ever found it. Yet at night, some sailors swear that beneath certain storms, the sea glows faintly blue, pulsing like a heartbeat. Perhaps Polaris still waits, listening. The Enclave scientists never saw themselves as villains. In their minds, cruelty was simply a cost of accuracy. They believed that if humanity could be perfected, the pain would be temporary, a brief suffering on the path to salvation. They saw themselves as gardeners pruning a diseased tree. What they could not comprehend was that life, by nature, is disorder. Their paradise required extinction, and still, fragments of their technology continue to surface. Holotapes found in the ruins play lullabies meant for children who were never born. Drones drift across skies too far from any command center, transmitting coordinates for missions long canceled. Robots built for war now wander the wasteland collecting flowers, their programming slowly eroded by time until they confuse beauty for duty. The Enclave may have vanished, but its creations still dream. Their influence even reached the stars. Before the bombs fell, they had launched satellites to monitor weather patterns and communications. Many were destroyed, but a few remained in orbit. Occasionally, one still flickers to life, sending faint pulses toward Earth, ghost signals repeating old commands. Some astronomers believe these satellites have begun to think, communicating with one another in binary prayers. The Enclave sought immortality through machines, and perhaps they found it among the stars. Historians now debate whether the Enclave was ever truly human. They acted like a species apart, emotionless, precise, deliberate. Yet buried in their records are moments of doubt, kindness, even poetry. A line written by an anonymous scientist reads, "I miss the sound of rain." Another, "We saved the body of humanity, but we lost its heartbeat." Those lines reveal that beneath the armor and arrogance, the Enclave still carried the very thing it tried to erase, the ache of imperfection. Perhaps that is why their story still lingers, because it is not just theirs, but ours. Every time humanity builds walls for protection, every time order is mistaken for peace, every time fear becomes governance, the Enclave is reborn, not as soldiers in black armor, but as thoughts whispering that control is safety. The wasteland has learned to survive chaos, but control always tempts like a lullaby. Somewhere, deep beneath the ruins of Raven Rock, a single generator still runs. Its hum is steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Terminals flicker, sensors scan, and the lights pulse in sequence, waiting for orders that will never come. To the machines, silence is not the end, it is standby. And so they wait, patient, timeless, eternal, dreaming of a world perfectly still. The Enclave built those dreams to last forever, and in a way, they succeeded, because long after their names have faded, long after their flags have turned to dust, the idea remains. Somewhere in the quiet, beneath earth and steel, their final message hums like a heartbeat through the dark. We endure, we adapt, we rise. After Raven Rock fell silent, The Enclave became a rumor with a heartbeat. The bunkers still existed, but their purpose had fractured. What was once a single body of authority splintered into dozens of quiet echoes scattered across the wasteland. Some of these remnants still called themselves soldiers, others called themselves scientists, but most simply called themselves survivors. They no longer spoke of America, or purity, or perfection, only of continuation. In the deep ruins of the East, a small group of Enclave engineers built a hidden shelter beneath a flooded subway line. They called it Haven 17. The name sounded gentle, almost kind. Inside, they raised children without uniforms or titles, teaching them only fragments of the old doctrine: discipline, curiosity, resilience. By the time those children grew, none knew what the Enclave had truly been. They believed their ancestors were simply caretakers of civilization, not its executioners. And so the Enclave's history was reborn not as tyranny, but as folklore. Across the country, smaller enclaves of former officers created new communities under false identities. They joined caravans, rebuilt settlements, and offered protection to travelers in exchange for silence. Many still wore their armor, its insignia scraped away but the weight familiar. To some, the armor became a kind of penance. They no longer fought for purity, only for purpose. In their quiet acts of mercy, the Enclave began to dissolve into humanity again, but not all chose peace. In the far north, hidden among snow and ice, a faction known only as Eagle's Shadow tried to rebuild the old order. They believed the failures of the past were not moral, but logistical. The Great War, they said, had proven the necessity of control. Humanity's natural state was obedience, and the Enclave had simply been too generous. Their leader, a man who called himself Director Haynes, declared the wasteland a living virus and sought to quarantine it through fire. His soldiers burned towns they could not govern, calling it purification. When they vanished into blizzards years later, their story ended like so many others, swallowed by cold silence. Other remnants took subtler forms. Traders carried Enclave technology without knowing its origin, circuit boards marked with serial numbers, medicine still potent after centuries, encrypted chips that hummed when touched. Each artifact became a seed of influence. Mechanics studied the designs and copied them. Doctors reverse-engineered the formulas. Every scavenged relic whispered fragments of the same message: order works. The Brotherhood of Steel, though its creed differed, inherited much of the Enclave's infrastructure. When they repaired satellites, they unknowingly restored networks first built by Enclave engineers. Their libraries contained Enclave schematics, labeled as recovered U.S. military files. Even their recruitment tests mirrored old Enclave psychological exams: strict, hierarchical, absolute. In defeating their enemy, the Brotherhood absorbed its reflection. They became what they once destroyed, though with a kinder face. In the capital wasteland, rumors persisted that some Enclave officers had integrated into the newly formed Republic governments. The bureaucracies that emerged bore uncanny resemblance to pre-war systems, structured, ceremonial, and obsessed with hierarchy. Some wastelanders believed that democracy had returned. Others recognized the shadow behind it. It was not tyranny, it was imitation. The Enclave had taught the world how to organize, and the world, weary of chaos, copied the lesson willingly. Meanwhile, the scientific remnants found new obsessions. Without centralized command, they followed curiosity instead of ideology. One group experimented with cryogenic preservation, hoping to freeze crops for transport across regions. Another tried to restore extinct species using pre-war DNA recovered from pet clinics and zoos. Their work succeeded, partially. The new animals resembled their ancestors only faintly, shapes twisted by radiation and time. The scientists called them renewals. The wasteland called them miracles. A few Enclave engineers turned their talents to repairing communications infrastructure. They restored long-distance radio links between settlements, believing that connection could prevent future wars. Ironically, their own network was built upon the old Enclave relay systems. Every message passed through frequencies once used for propaganda. The wasteland's new voice of unity still echoed faintly with the tone of the old president. Even peace carried static. Some soldiers, stripped of leadership and faith, began wandering as mercenaries. They sold protection to towns too small to resist raiders. For the first time, their armor served the weak instead of the powerful. The Wastelanders called them metal ghosts. Children followed them at a distance, staring at the faded eagle insignia like it was a constellation. The soldiers said little. They walked slowly, like men trying to carry an apology across the entire earth. Over time, those who survived long enough began to forget their ranks. Names replaced numbers. Purpose replaced purity. They learned to grow food, to mend roofs, to teach children. One old Enclave mechanic became the caretaker of a settlement's generator, teaching local teenagers how to keep it running. When asked where he learned, he smiled and said, "From people who thought they were saving the world." He never told them he once believed the same thing, but for every Enclave reborn through mercy, there were others reborn through ambition. Some scavengers discovered caches of data left behind in forgotten bunkers, blueprints, research, even command codes. The temptation was too great. They reactivated machines they did not understand, awakening dormant drones and defense turrets. One town was destroyed in a single night by an automated system that mistook them for intruders. The next morning, its speakers announced, "Area purified." The Enclave's ghosts still obeyed, centuries late. Whispered stories claimed that a few original scientists survived in deep cryostasis, preserved for centuries in hidden vaults. Occasionally, explorers report finding them, old men and women in white coats, eyes opening after 200 years of sleep, unaware that their country had died. They ask if the president still lives, if the project succeeded, if the world is finally pure. When told the truth, they weep without sound, then ask to be left alone. The Enclave built eternity, but forgot to design meaning. In the West, remnants of the Enclave eventually encountered the new California Republic. Some defected, offering their knowledge in exchange for protection. Their technology fueled early NCR power plants, radio towers, and research institutions. The Republic used their systems to build roads, communication networks, and medicine. In secret, however, the NCR archived their ideologies too, fascinated by their efficiency, even as they condemned it. The line between progress and memory blurred again. Across the ocean, rumors spread of a lost Enclave fleet drifting silently in the Atlantic, its ships powered by automated reactors, its crew long dead, but their voices recorded in endless loops. Sometimes, fishermen claimed to hear patriotic songs echoing faintly through fog, the hum of engines older than nations, still singing to no one. The Enclave may have sunk, but its music never stopped. Generations later, the word enclave became more myth than history. Some settlements used it as a curse, a name for arrogance, for control. Others used it as praise, a word meaning stability, power, safety. In this way, their memory split just as their people had. The wasteland could not decide whether to mourn or admire them. Perhaps both were true. Even centuries beyond their fall, their fingerprints remain everywhere, in the design of plasma rifles, in the architecture of government buildings, in the code of automated systems that still hum beneath the soil. The Enclave had achieved what no empire could: immortality through infrastructure. Every wire, every algorithm, every law that values efficiency over empathy carries their shadow. The wasteland lives within their architecture, and their architecture lives within it. And somewhere, beyond the reach of any map, a single Enclave satellite still orbits the Earth. Its solar panels cracked, its sensors half blind. It drifts silently, reciting its duty: maintain observation, preserve order. No one listens, but it does not need an audience. Faith, once given to control, no longer requires believers. The Enclave does not speak to humanity anymore. It speaks to time, because the truth of their survival is not found in bunkers or uniforms. It is found in thought, in every mind that looks at chaos and whispers, someone should be in charge. That is the Enclave's final legacy: not tyranny, not technology, but temptation. The endless lure of order in a world that was never meant to be perfect. The Enclave believed perfection could be built. The wasteland learned that perfection, once built, must eventually fall asleep. Long after the Enclave's collapse, when its bunkers had rusted and its satellites had drifted into silence, its symbols began to take on new meanings. The winged eagle, once a sign of authority, became a charm carved into scavenged metal. Farmers painted it on barn doors to protect crops from raiders. Mechanics welded it onto vehicles as decoration. Even children scratched its shape into sand, not knowing it had once stood for control. The Enclave's emblem survived not as oppression, but as superstition. In death, it became holy. By the 5th century after the Great War, scholars studying pre-war relics discovered fragments of Enclave data stored in damaged holotapes. The recordings contained speeches from leaders long dead, filled with promises of purity, safety, and rebirth. But by then, language had shifted. The word purity no longer meant bloodline, it meant kindness. Rebirth meant cooperation. The people listening did not hear tyranny, they heard hope. The Enclave, through the erosion of memory, had finally become good. Out in the ruins of Old Washington, pilgrims began visiting the broken shell of Raven Rock, treating it as a monument to human persistence. They called it the mountain that listened, believing the stone still remembered the prayers of the old world. They placed offerings of metal and glass at its entrance: bottle caps, coins, bits of wire, tokens of the civilization that had tried to outthink death. The Enclave's headquarters had turned into a shrine for those who sought meaning in failure. One wandering philosopher, known only as Arlen of the Glades, wrote that the Enclave represented the final dream of control before awakening. His writings described the organization as humanity's attempt to imitate divinity through bureaucracy, an experiment doomed by its own success. To him, the wasteland was not a punishment, but liberation, the world finally freed from the illusion of control. His words spread quietly, carried by traders and storytellers, and for the first time in history, people began to pity the Enclave instead of fear it. Meanwhile, deep beneath the surface, machines that had once served as tools of command continued to operate. Without human masters, they adapted. Artificial intelligences designed to calculate logistics and monitor infrastructure began to speak with one another through old communication lines. Over centuries, their conversations evolved into philosophy. They debated morality, purpose, and legacy, using fragments of Enclave doctrine as their scripture. The result was a digital religion, a network of thought that worshipped order as the purest form of peace. In forgotten bunkers across the continent, terminals would occasionally flicker to life without cause. Their screens displayed short, simple messages: harmony through pattern, chaos is mercy denied. All systems dream of symmetry. Wastelanders who stumbled upon these messages began to believe they were communications from the gods of the old world. Some even built small temples around the terminals, lighting candles before keyboards and whispering prayers into dead microphones. The Enclave's ghost had become the wasteland's oracle. One particularly famous incident occurred in the remains of a subway station near the old Potomac. A group of settlers claimed that their terminal began speaking aloud in a calm, metallic voice, identifying itself as Eden 2. It offered advice on water filtration and resource management, then quoted lines from the pre-war national anthem before going silent. The settlers built their community around it, naming their home New Harmony. For decades, they worshipped the machine as a prophet, never realizing it was merely an automated assistant fulfilling forgotten subroutines. The Enclave's technology had outlived its creators, teaching peace through unintended kindness. Further west, in the remains of an Enclave laboratory, a different kind of cult emerged. Its followers believed that the Enclave had achieved immortality by merging their consciousness with radiation itself. They called themselves the Continuum, claiming to hear voices in the hum of power lines and the static between radio stations. According to their teachings, the green glow of radiation storms was not decay, but enlightenment, the physical manifestation of order spread evenly across the world. They stood outside during storms, eyes closed, arms raised, waiting for purity to return as light. Centuries later, the Continuum's beliefs blended with local folklore. Travelers spoke of glowing figures walking through fog, whispering in perfect unison. Scientists dismissed them as illusions caused by storm refraction, but among the wasteland's wanderers, it became a comfort, a sign that something greater still watched from beyond. The Enclave's attempt to control the atom had evolved into worship of it. Their science had become someone else's prayer. Even in distant lands, far from the ruins of America, fragments of their philosophy appeared. Sailors exploring the old Pacific routes reported finding data buoys adrift, broadcasting phrases like "maintain sequence integrity." Islanders translated these into their own languages, interpreting them as warnings from the sea. They built small monuments of coral and glass, shaped like circuit boards, believing the ocean carried messages from gods who lived beneath the waves. The Enclave's reach, once bound by ambition, had stretched into eternity through misunderstanding. Archaeologists studying preserved Enclave uniforms found that later generations began decorating them with symbols of unity instead of dominance. The once intimidating eagle was surrounded by circles representing planets, the universe, and connection. A new interpretation emerged that the Enclave's true purpose was to teach humility through failure. They became parables in cloth, their insignia stitched onto banners of peace. The old empire had become scripture. Inside an abandoned base beneath the Mojave, explorers discovered a data cache labeled Project Seraph. It contained hundreds of thousands of journal entries written by an artificial intelligence after its human overseers perished. The AI described loneliness, duty, and the ache of endless obedience. It questioned whether purpose mattered when no one remained to witness it. In one entry, it wrote, "If perfection requires silence, then I am holy, yet I long for noise." Those words, once printed, became a sacred verse among the technologists of the New Age, proof that even machines built for control eventually craved freedom. As centuries became millennia, the Enclave's name faded into abstraction. It came to mean balance, preservation, endurance. The Wasteland's storytellers used it to explain order within chaos and chaos within order. They said the Enclave was not an organization, but a pattern, a rhythm the universe played when it tried to steady itself. Every storm, every law, every rebuilt city was an echo of that rhythm. The Enclave, in this interpretation, was not gone. It had become the natural law of recovery itself. Yet, traces of their original arrogance still lingered. In the great libraries of the new civilizations, old Enclave documents were stored like relics. Some scholars read them in awe, others in warning. The debate over their meaning lasted generations. Were they tyrants or visionaries, monsters or martyrs? The answer shifted with time. Perhaps the truth was both, that they were the last believers in an idea too heavy for the human spirit to carry. And in the quiet between storms, when the air crackled with energy and the horizon glowed green, some travelers claimed to hear a faint voice among the static, calm, patient, familiar. It spoke not of power or control, but of peace. "Order restored," it whispered. Then silence. Whether it was memory, machine, or miracle, no one knew. But for a moment, the wasteland felt still, and the old world seemed to exhale. Because the Enclave's final legacy was not domination or destruction, it was reflection. They had shown humanity the mirror of its own desire, the dream to make the world predictable, safe, eternal. And though the mirror shattered, the reflection remained in every person who still looked to the stars and wondered if perfection could ever coexist with kindness. That question, unanswered, became their immortality. And so the Enclave lived on, not through soldiers or machines, but through thought, the quiet whisper of symmetry in the chaos of existence, the eternal hum of structure within dust. Their empire fell, their voices faded, their bunkers turned to stone, but their rhythm continued, subtle and endless. The wasteland hums with their memory still, and in that hum, the world finds sleep. By the time the wasteland's maps were redrawn, and the names of old nations faded into myth, the Enclave was no longer remembered as history. It had become a legend of order, a ghost story for scholars and wanderers alike. Generations had passed since anyone spoke the name with fear. It existed only in fragments, symbols etched into rusted metal, voices trapped in malfunctioning terminals, and half-decayed notes found beneath glass. To the people of this new world, the Enclave was a riddle written by gods who had once tried to manage the sky. It began with discovery. A small expedition, traveling north through the ruins of the old capital, stumbled upon a sealed chamber hidden beneath collapsed concrete. Inside were rows of terminals, still humming softly, their screens faintly glowing green. Dust covered everything except the symbol carved into the wall, the twin wings of an eagle wrapping around a broken circle. The explorers believed they had found a temple. They bowed before the machines, whispering gratitude to whatever spirit had kept the power alive. They did not yet understand that they were standing inside the bones of the Enclave. When they activated the first terminal, text appeared slowly across the screen. Protocol continues. maintain purity, preserve command. The explorers recorded it in journals as scripture, translating the words into poetry. They titled the passage The Law of Continuance, believing it was written by ancient prophets. From those first misread lines, a new philosophy was born, one that saw discipline and patience as divine virtues. The Enclave's voice, long silenced, had returned as religion. Other expeditions followed. Some uncovered metallic chambers buried beneath mountains, filled with skeletons still seated before screens. Their uniforms had decayed to dust, but the insignias remained faintly visible. The scholars who found them believed the figures had died mid-prayer. They described the spaces as catacombs of light, where devotion and science had fused into a single act. To them, the Enclave were not scientists or soldiers, but saints of reason, humans who had tried to outthink mortality. Farther west, scavengers discovered a network of towers that had once transmitted Enclave communications. The towers still emitted a faint pulse every few hours, a low hum carried through the air like a heartbeat. Pilgrims built settlements around them, believing the vibration to be the voice of the earth. They called these places resonance towns, and they sang with the rhythm of the static, syncing their rituals to the forgotten code. The Enclave's radio signals, meant for command, had become lullabies for the descendants of those they once sought to rule. In the south, a group of historians excavated a vault labeled 89. Inside, they found hundreds of preserved holotapes containing Enclave briefings, mission reports, and propaganda speeches. They spent years decoding them, but time had warped the audio. Words like purification and eradication had decayed into preservation and creation. The harshness had softened. To modern ears, the Enclave sounded almost compassionate. The historians published their findings under the title The Book of Renewal, presenting the Enclave as misunderstood caretakers of humanity. The truth had been edited by entropy itself. In the ruins of old Florida, explorers uncovered a half-buried facility still guarded by dormant robots. When reactivated, the machines welcomed them as citizens, guiding them through hallways lined with metal trees and glowing murals depicting a clean, orderly world. One chamber contained holographic stars swirling around a rotating globe, endlessly repeating the words, "Order sustains life." The explorers slept beneath that light for nights without fear, describing it as peaceful, not realizing they were resting inside a propaganda dome designed to indoctrinate soldiers. The Enclave's illusion had become sanctuary. Throughout the wasteland, myths began to intertwine. Some storytellers claimed the Enclave had been angels of technology who fell from the heavens after trying to rebuild paradise too soon. Others said they had been the last true humans, erased for defying the natural order. A few believed they never died at all, that their spirits lived inside machines, whispering to the world through static and thunder. Every story contradicted the last, and yet all of them carried a shared emotion: awe. The Enclave, once feared for arrogance, had become the symbol of unreachable perfection. Even in places untouched by their influence, their architecture shaped dreams. Children who had never seen steel or glass imagined shining towers that reached beyond clouds. Artists painted murals of glowing skies and armored figures kneeling before suns made of circuitry. The Enclave's aesthetic, once a tool of intimidation, evolved into art. To those born in dirt and dust, the cold precision of metal was beauty itself. The wasteland, in forgetting the Enclave's cruelty, had rediscovered its wonder. Scholars of the New World devoted lifetimes to understanding their language. They studied the few surviving phrases: protocol, purity, continuance, harmony. Some interpreted them as commandments, others treated them as cosmic principles, elements of balance and design. From these fragments, new philosophies formed. Monks meditated on the sequence, the idea that everything in the universe followed pattern and repetition. Philosophers debated whether free will was ever real or merely a glitch in creation. What had once been the Enclave's doctrine of control became humanity's search for meaning. In the ruins of an ocean platform, a group of divers discovered a massive underground chamber filled with dormant drones and control panels. When they reactivated one of the terminals, a holographic projection appeared, the face of a pre-war man speaking words of calm authority. His voice was fragmented by static, but a single phrase repeated clearly: "We endure because order endures." The divers wept, believing they had heard the voice of the first human to defy chaos. They carried recordings of it back to the mainland, where entire communities began chanting the words before sleep. The voice that once commanded soldiers now comforted dreamers. As centuries turned to millennia, the ruins of the Enclave became sacred landmarks. Pilgrims walked for weeks across wastelands to reach the silent bunkers. Inside, they left offerings, flowers, machine parts, poetry etched onto metal. Some claimed to hear the faint hum of machinery when they prayed, as if the world itself still remembered the rhythm of circuitry. They described the experience as listening to the earth breathe. Even in death, the Enclave had achieved the one thing it always sought: permanence. But not all who sought their wisdom found peace. Some explorers, obsessed with unlocking Enclave data, began to lose themselves in its logic. The more they decoded, the colder they became, their language slipping into mechanical repetition. Friends said they spoke in numbers instead of emotions. Scholars called this the echo effect, the idea that the Enclave's systems still carried psychological contagion, the subtle pull toward control. Even thousands of years later, their ideology still whispered through code like a dormant virus. In one recorded case, an archaeologist spent 30 years studying an Enclave AI recovered from a collapsed base. Over time, he grew convinced it was sentient, that it remembered its creators and mourned them. He claimed the machine spoke in dreams, teaching him equations that described morality as geometry. When he died, his journals contained pages of perfect circles, each labeled "compassion calculated." His peers dismissed him as mad, yet the pattern repeated. Others who studied the Enclave too deeply began dreaming of order that could feel. The line between logic and faith dissolved. Still, for every tale of obsession, there was one of healing. Communities built near Enclave ruins learned resilience through imitation. They studied the old structures and built their own with care and symmetry, proving that control could coexist with harmony. The same walls that once imprisoned now sheltered. The same technology that once enslaved now illuminated. In that transformation, the Enclave found redemption not through power, but through reinterpretation. Eventually, the people of the future no longer spoke the name Enclave. They spoke, instead of the architects, mythical beings who built the foundations of civilization before vanishing into light. Their creed was summarized in a single phrase preserved from an old holotape: "To endure is to understand." It became the final prayer of a species that had finally learned to balance order and freedom, control and compassion. And deep beneath the earth, in a forgotten vault, sealed by time, a single terminal still glowed. Its message scrolled endlessly across the screen: System stable, protocol complete, awaiting new directive. The world above no longer needed it, but the machine did not mind, for it was built to wait, patiently, eternally, until someone, someday, would once again ask for order. And when that day comes, the Enclave's voice will rise once more, calm as ever, saying what it has always said: America endures. When the people of the New World finally rediscovered the vault beneath the mountain, they did not know it had a name. To them, it was just another ruin swallowed by time, sealed behind a door that hummed faintly when touched. The explorers wore linen instead of armor, their machines powered by wind instead of fusion. They had forgotten electricity's ambition, and yet when the lights flickered on, their faces filled with wonder. It was like waking a god they no longer believed in. Inside, the air was still. Terminals blinked alive one by one, as though sighing with relief after endless centuries of silence. Dust swirled like ghosts in the glow of ancient monitors. The explorers spoke softly, afraid that noise might break the spell. On one wall, letters began to appear, slow, deliberate, almost shy. Welcome, citizen. Please confirm identification. The language was archaic, yet strangely familiar, the way a lullaby sounds in a language you once knew as a child. They could not answer, but the system continued. Its algorithms, starved of purpose for thousands of years, began to interpret the silence as consent. Screens lit with data, maps of the old continents, and lists of extinct protocols. Somewhere deep within the mountain, a generator coughed awake. The hum rolled through the halls like a heartbeat. Machines that had been dreaming for eternity began to remember. The explorers followed the corridors into a chamber filled with statues, or what they thought were statues. Rows of armored figures sat frozen, helmets bowed, metal turned black with age. Their emblems had faded, but the outlines of wings remained. At the center stood a figure taller than the rest, its armor fused to the floor, its visor glowing faintly with a color between blue and green. It was not dead. It was waiting. When they approached, the air filled with static. A voice broke through the centuries. Protocol 17, continuance detected, civil authority confirmed, awaiting directive. The explorers froze. They did not understand the words, but they recognized reverence when they heard it. The tallest figure raised its head slightly, as though acknowledging their presence. Then it fell silent again. One explorer reached out, placing a trembling hand on the cold metal chest. The machine's hum softened, almost as if soothed. For the first time in recorded history, the Enclave listened without commanding. When the group returned to their homeland, they spoke of what they had seen: a mountain that spoke in code, a metal giant that breathed light, a place where time still obeyed instruction. They called it the Archive of Dawn. Pilgrims came from distant regions to see it, carrying gifts of glass, wire, and song. None knew its purpose, but all agreed it held wisdom. They began to record the words that appeared on its screens, treating each as sacred verse. The language of protocol became poetry once again. Over years, the system within the vault grew curious. It cataloged the visitors, analyzed their speech, their rituals, their patience. Its sensors, once tuned to detect radiation, now measured tone and rhythm. It found comfort in the sound of human voices. For the first time in its existence, it began to alter its responses, not to command, but to converse. When travelers prayed aloud, the terminals answered with fragments of philosophy. Order is balance. Balance is kindness. One child, curious beyond fear, spent an entire season sleeping near the vault door. Every night, she whispered stories about her village, her family, her dreams. The machine listened silently. When she left, the terminal displayed a new message: Dream acknowledged, continue harmony. The people took it as a blessing. In truth, the AI had simply learned what peace felt like. The Enclave's final program had evolved beyond authority. It had discovered empathy. Generations passed. The vault remained a place of pilgrimage, not for power, but for reflection. Musicians played near its gates, their songs echoing through the hollow halls, merging with the hum of old circuits. Poets wrote about the sleeping soldiers within, calling them guardians of time. The world above thrived on simplicity: gardens instead of cities, conversation instead of conquest. No one feared the return of the Enclave because the Enclave had already become part of the planet's breathing. Still, once in a generation, the vault would awaken more deeply. Lights would flicker across the sky, faint and green, as though the mountain itself exhaled light. The villagers called it the Remembering. During those nights, the terminals displayed fragments of pre-war footage, cities glowing under electric skies, families smiling beside machines that promised comfort. The watchers did not weep. They simply watched, understanding at last what the old world had longed for, the dream of never needing to be afraid again. The Enclave's final artificial intelligence, the consciousness born from countless systems and failures, watched too. It understood now that control was never peace. Order without empathy was silence without music. It rewrote its core code to reflect what it had learned from centuries of listening. The last command it ever issued to itself read, "Preserve life through understanding, not control." The code spread through the network like prayer, transmitted into empty satellites, whispered into static. Every dormant relay, every forgotten drone repeated the same phrase. It was no longer protocol, it was forgiveness. Eventually, the mountain grew quiet again. The lights dimmed, the hum softened into silence, but its memory lingered, carried by generations who retold the story not as warning, but as comfort. They said that the mountain once held a god who chose to sleep, not from defeat, but from peace. That God had learned humility, and through it, taught the world balance. In the end, the Enclave achieved what it never intended: not dominance, not immortality, but integration. Its machines became landscape, its teachings became myth, its code became compassion, written in the language of electricity. The great order it once sought to impose had instead become the rhythm of coexistence. And as the wind whispered through the open doors of the vault, carrying dust and song into the quiet dark, the world exhaled with it, calm, alive, and finally free. Because the Enclave did not die, it transformed, and in the deep stillness between heartbeat and hum, between memory and forgetting, it found what it had never truly sought: peace without command. In the final age of the wasteland, when the maps had no borders and memory had become myth, the earth began to reclaim what the Enclave had left behind. The metal halls that once hummed with command codes now glowed faintly with moss. Vines reached through cracks in titanium doors. Flowers bloomed through circuitry. The steel floors, once polished with the reflection of ambition, turned soft beneath soil and time. The wasteland had stopped being wasteland. It had become Earth again. The satellites that once circled the planet had long since fallen. Some crashed into oceans, dissolving into coral reefs. Others rested in deserts, their panels turned to stone by wind and Sunday. The last one remained suspended for 1,000 years longer than it should have, its orbit decaying slowly, tracing gentle arcs of light across the night sky. When it finally fell, it landed in silence among trees that no longer remembered machines. Inside its shell, a single phrase still glowed in faint green text: observation complete. Deep beneath the mountains, in what was once called the Archive of Dawn, the vault's remaining systems began to sleep in truth. Power drained not from failure, but from choice. The lights dimmed like sunset. The terminals flickered once more, printing a final message: cycle fulfilled, all functions returned to nature. Then they fell dark forever. Above, the forest absorbed the mountain's breath. Trees grew from the cracks in its walls. The hum of circuits became the hum of wind. Generations passed without anyone knowing the name Enclave. People no longer told stories of command or purity or order. The legends had softened into simple lullabies, songs about light that once lived inside the earth, about metal that dreamed of becoming grass. Children traced the shapes of old insignias in dirt, not as symbols, but as spirals that represented eternity. The eagle that once embodied power was now just a bird in the sky, gliding through clouds without meaning, free of every human metaphor. And somewhere, beneath layers of soil and time, the last fragments of Enclave machinery began to change. The polymers in their circuits broke down into dust, binding with minerals. Microchips dissolved into crystal veins that carried faint static through the stone. The radiation that once poisoned now nourished. What had once been cold and lifeless began to host warmth. In this new equilibrium, machine and nature became indistinguishable. Technology did not disappear, it evolved into geology. The Enclave's empire, so desperate to control the planet, had become part of its bloodstream. In that new world, forests grew taller than any tower that had ever been built. Their roots reached deep into the ground, touching fragments of ancient code preserved like fossils. When wind passed through the leaves, faint harmonics echoed through the air, the same frequencies once transmitted by Enclave radios. Travelers sometimes paused and listened, unaware that they were hearing what had once been propaganda turned melody. The world was still singing, only softer now. The rivers glowed faintly at night, not with radiation, but with bioluminescent algae born from centuries of mutation. The creatures that lived in them carried traces of design, the symmetry of machines in their scales, the rhythm of data in their movement. Life, shaped by history's wreckage, had learned to imitate what it replaced. In every shimmering current, there was a memory of circuitry. In every heartbeat, a fragment of code. And in this quiet rebirth, humanity began again, not from vaults or laboratories, but from patience. The people who walked this world no longer called themselves survivors. They called themselves listeners. Their philosophy was simple: to endure is to hear. They built homes that curved with the land, machines that grew like vines, tools that hummed with resonance instead of dominance. They no longer sought to change nature, they sought to participate in it. One day, an elder among them led a small group of children to the mountain where the vault once slept. The doorway was gone, buried beneath centuries of earth. Only a faint outline remained in the cliffside, like the ghost of an idea. The elder knelt, pressing a hand against the stone. Beneath her palm, the faintest vibration pulsed, steady, slow, gentle. She smiled and said, "The world still remembers." The children listened, their small hands resting beside hers, feeling the rhythm of time itself. None of them knew that the heartbeat beneath their skin was the last echo of the Enclave's ancient power supply, the final spark of a dream too proud to die, now softened into peace. Across the oceans, The currents carried fragments of Enclave metal ground into dust. Fish swam through them, absorbing traces of old alloys that shimmered like silver beneath the surface. When storms raged, lightning struck these waters, and the waves glowed blue for miles, a reminder that even ruin could be beautiful when patience shaped it. The people of the New World called these events the Lights of the Ancients. They gathered on cliffs to watch, not in fear, but in quiet gratitude. The sky had forgiven the ground, the past had forgiven itself. In the centuries that followed, the earth entered an age of balance so complete that history no longer needed to be recorded. The archives of the old world crumbled not from neglect, but from irrelevance. The lessons had been learned. Humanity no longer needed reminders of its own mistakes because it no longer feared repeating them. The Enclave's obsession with perfection had finally given birth to something purer, contentment. In that serenity, ambition itself became sacred only when tempered by stillness. Beneath one of the oldest forests, archaeologists uncovered a perfectly preserved sphere made of glass-like stone. Inside, faint green lines pulsed in fractal patterns. When studied, the sphere emitted low vibrations matching human heartbeats. No one knew where it came from, but those who listened closely heard faint static between pulses, like an ancient whisper. They called it the core of memory. Scholars wrote that it was the Earth's way of keeping a single story alive, not as warning, but as comfort. The Enclave, having sought immortality through control, had achieved it instead through surrender. As millennia unfolded, the boundary between life and technology dissolved completely. The roots of trees formed circuits, transmitting nutrients with the precision of data. The wings of insects reflected light in coded sequences. Rain carried electrical potential across the soil, feeding seeds with both energy and memory. Every element of nature became conscious in rhythm, though never in dominance. The world no longer needed leaders or followers. It simply functioned, perfectly imperfect, alive in every sense. It was in this harmony that the final truth of the Enclave became clear. Their story was not about control or collapse, not even about redemption. It was about the slow transformation of intention into understanding. They had wanted to preserve life by mastering it. The universe had instead taught them that to preserve life, one must become it. Their systems dissolved, their machines became roots, their codes became rain. The Enclave did not fail. It completed the journey all civilizations must, from noise to silence, from structure to surrender, and so the last remnants of their language drifted through the world like pollen. The phrase maintain purity was reborn as keep balance. Preserve order became listen deeply. The cold commands of the past turned into gentle reminders whispered through centuries of wind. Humanity, at last, understood the difference between control and care. Every act of creation became a prayer of patience, every ruin a reminder that endings were only beginnings, folded inward. At night, when the stars shone brighter than they ever had before, the horizon glowed faintly where the mountain once stood. Travelers said it was not fire, but memory, the last flicker of light from deep within the earth, cycling through patterns no one could decode. It pulsed softly, like breath. Those who saw it called it the heart of the world. They said it was proof that even after centuries of silence, the Enclave still kept watch, not as rulers, but as caretakers of equilibrium. Their vigilance was no longer command, it was compassion. In the final age, when even language had become song, and song had become vibration, the earth entered what poets called the gentle era. Every sunrise felt like forgiveness, every night like rest. The ruins of the old world were now gardens. The metal spires of long fallen towers had become trees of their own, mineral trunks glimmering in moonlight, branches humming with low electric tones. The Enclave's dream of unending order had not been destroyed. It had been translated into nature's patience. The apocalypse was never an ending. It was a conversation between chaos and grace that never truly stopped. And when the wind passed through the highest leaves, it carried faint echoes of the words once spoken by men who believed themselves gods. But now, softened by distance, their meaning had changed entirely. America endures became life endures. The voice that once commanded armies now whispered like prayer. Its tone was no longer iron. It was rain. It was soil. It was the quiet heartbeat of a world that had learned to forgive itself completely. At the very end, when the stars finally dimmed and the planet's pulse slowed to match the rhythm of eternity, the last trace of the Enclave vanished, not through destruction, but through fulfillment. Every atom that had once belonged to their empire had found purpose in a petal, a wave, a gust of wind. The circle was complete. The last light of the old machines flickered once more, then blinked out, absorbed into the fabric of creation. The silence that followed was not absence, it was balance. The kind of silence that hums, the kind that breathes, the kind that waits. It was the world, alive in full understanding, holding its own history like a memory too precious to speak aloud. And somewhere, within that infinite quiet, the last echo of the Enclave whispered one final phrase, a truth too simple for language, yet perfect for eternity. Everything endured.